The energy in the room had shifted entirely. The hum of conversation and the warmth of celebration had drained away, replaced by the heavy quiet of realization. Julia remained still, standing by the wooden box, letting the truth settle. Her mother was the first to reach for the documents, her hand hesitating over the letter, as if touching it might confirm the worst. She traced the signature with her finger, her expression tightening as she compared it to the letter Josh had read earlier. The contrast was undeniable. One carried the weight of age, of a hand weakened by time and illness. The other was smooth, practiced, too perfect. A strange tension rippled through the family. Some shifted uncomfortably in their seats, others exchanged glances, unsure of what to say. The weight of deception was too thick to ignore. Josh's victory had collapsed in a matter of moments, and the silence now demanded an answer. Julia watched as Josh's composure cracked. His fingers clenched at his sides, his eyes darting toward the paper, the realization setting in that he had lost. His shoulders squared, as if bracing for a fight. But there was no battle left to win. Their father picked up the deed, adjusting his glasses as he read. His brow furrowed deeper with each passing second. He flipped to the notary seal, scanning the date, confirming that the transfer had been finalized months ago. Slowly, he exhaled, setting the document down with an almost defeated sigh. It was as though he were searching for another explanation, something to lessen the weight of the truth. But there was none. Josh's girlfriend, Teresa, who had been beaming with pride earlier, took a slow step back. Her expression had transformed from admiration to something closer to disbelief. Her eyes flicked between the letters, her lips parting slightly, as if trying to process the implications. Julia didn't speak. She didn't need to. The evidence was already tearing through the room, stripping away the falsehood Josh had built. Then the dam broke. Josh let out a breath, one that sounded more like a scoff, his forced confidence cracking. His jaw tightened, and the carefully curated expression of success and entitlement began to crumble. His fists clenched at his sides, and the room braced for his reaction. His voice, when it came, was low but shaking with anger. His words weren't an admission of guilt, but a desperate attempt to shift the blame. He threw his hands into the air, pacing slightly, his body language erratic. Julia remained impassive, watching as his frustration turned outward, spiraling from disbelief to justification. His words came in bursts, about fairness, about how he had always been overlooked, about how this was supposed to be his moment. His accusations were desperate, unfocused. He wasn't arguing the truth. He was lashing out because he had been caught. His mother turned to him then, something unreadable in her expression. Hurt, disappointment, or maybe something even more painful, recognition. She was seeing him clearly for the first time. The others weren't buying it either. The shift in their expressions was undeniable. The admiration had faded, replaced by something colder, something wary. Teresa took another step back, her arms crossing over her chest. She shook her head slightly, her mouth pressing into a thin line. Her eyes met Julia's, and Julia could see it. The realization, the disgust. Teresa had believed in Josh's moment of triumph. Now she saw the truth. Josh turned to their father then, as if searching for an ally, but there was no lifeline. Their father shook his head, slowly, deliberately. The silence stretched. Julia stayed where she was, her heart steady. She had spent years believing that standing up for herself meant causing conflict, that truth had to be softened, that she had to make herself small to keep the peace. But her grandfather had always told her otherwise. When you have truth on your side, Jules, you don't need to shout. Josh had spent his whole life performing, crafting stories, making himself seem bigger, more deserving. But here, in this moment, he had nothing left to perform. The truth had been laid bare. There was nowhere left to hide. Julia's mother, still holding the letters, let out a slow breath and turned to Josh. The words she spoke were quiet, but the weight of them was immense. Josh's face paled. Teresa's gaze dropped to the floor, and Julia knew that this moment would break something between them. Josh had built his world on shallow validation, on others believing in his version of events. Without that, without the admiration, without people clapping him on the back, what did he have left? Josh clenched his jaw, standing there as the attention that had once lifted him now crushed him. The room felt different now, emptier. He had lost something tonight, something far more valuable than property. Julia exhaled, steadying herself. She had done what needed to be done. She hadn't planned on revenge. This wasn't about winning. It was about setting things right, and she had. The morning light filtered through the curtains, casting long streaks of golden warmth across Julia's apartment. But there was no warmth inside her. The events of the previous night still clung to her like a heavy weight. The confrontation, the lies exposed, the looks of betrayal, it all played on a loop in her mind. She had barely slept. After leaving Josh's house, she had returned home, sitting at her kitchen table for hours, staring at the notarized deed in her hands. The truth had been laid out, undeniable and clear, yet the fallout had only just begun. A sharp knock at the door snapped her from her thoughts. She knew who it was before she even answered. Taking a deep breath, she steeled herself before unlocking the door. Her parents stood on the other side, their expressions grim. Her mother's lips were pressed into a tight line, her father's brow furrowed deeply. They stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, moving with an air of quiet fury. She had expected this. Her mother spoke first, her voice sharp, clipped. She didn't ask if Julia had slept or if she was okay. Instead, she launched directly into her anger, accusing her of humiliating Josh in front of the entire family. Julia clenched her jaw, remaining silent. She had spent a lifetime letting their words wash over her, minimizing her own pain for the sake of keeping the peace. Not today. Her father chimed in, his voice lower but just as cutting. He said she had put them in an impossible position, that families weren't supposed to air their grievances so publicly, that Josh had made a mistake, but did it really warrant this level of cruelty? Cruelty. The word burned in her ears. It was cruel that she had exposed a lie. It was cruel that she had stood her ground. She took a slow breath, willing herself to stay calm, but the fury bubbled beneath her skin. It wasn't just about last night. It was about every moment before it. Every time she had been pushed aside for Josh, every time she had worked twice as hard just to be acknowledged, every time she had convinced herself that maybe one day they would see her, they never had. Her mother stepped forward, then softening her tone. She told Julia that Josh had been struggling, that the cabin would help him find stability, that he needed it more than she did. That was when Julia's restraint snapped. For years, she had let them shape the narrative. She had allowed them to justify their choices, to convince her that she was strong enough not to need their support. But strength was not the absence of pain. Strength did not mean silence. Her voice came out steady, unwavering, as she laid out every injustice, every slight, every time she had been told to step aside, to be understanding, to let Josh have what he wanted. She told them how Grandpa had seen her, had acknowledged her worth when they never had. Her mother's expression hardened, and her father shook his head. They refused to accept it. To them, she was overreacting, playing the victim, being difficult. The conversation went in circles, each argument met with deflection. And then her father said something that sent a chill through her. He told her that family should forgive, that holding on to resentment would only hurt her, that giving up the cabin would be the right thing to do. She stared at him, heart pounding. They weren't just asking her to give up a piece of property. They were asking her to submit, to fold under the weight of their expectations once again, to hand over the one thing that had been truly hers. Her decision was instant. No. Her father's face darkened, and her mother let out a heavy sigh as if Julia was being impossibly unreasonable. But she didn't care. For the first time in her life, she wasn't asking for their approval. Without another word, she walked to the front door and opened it, silently telling them to leave. Her mother scoffed, grabbing her purse. Her father lingered a moment longer, searching her face as if hoping she would change her mind. When she didn't, he shook his head and walked past her, muttering something about regret. The door clicked shut behind them, and the silence that followed was deafening. Julia felt the first tear slip down her cheek, not from sadness, but from exhaustion. She had lost them, or maybe she had never truly had them in the first place. The hours passed in a blur. She couldn't bring herself to move from the kitchen table, her thoughts tangled in the wreckage of what had just happened. Then her phone buzzed. Her breath hitched when she saw the name on the screen, a legal board. Her stomach dropped. With shaking fingers, she opened the email. The words blurred together for a moment before the meaning became clear. Josh had filed a claim. He was challenging the deed. Her hands clenched into fists. Even now, after everything, he was still trying to take it from her. Beneath the legal jargon, she saw his argument laid out in simple terms. He was contesting the legitimacy of the deed, arguing that she had coerced their grandfather into transferring the property, that the real intention had been for it to remain in the estate. He was trying to undo everything. She let out a slow, shaky breath. This wasn't just about the cabin anymore. This was about the lengths her family would go to in order to keep her in her place, about how they had spent their entire lives reinforcing the idea that she was second to Josh. She had played by their rules her entire life. Not anymore. She reached for her phone, her fingers steady now, as she dialed her lawyer. She wouldn't let them win. Not this time. 6 months had passed since the night Jules had confronted her brother, Josh, and exposed his lies. 6 months since she had learned that her family would always see her as secondary to him. The cabin, once a place of warmth and nostalgia, had become her sanctuary. She had spent every weekend restoring it, honoring the spirit of her grandfather's wishes. It was no longer just a property. It was a symbol of her independence, but Josh wasn't done trying to take it from her. The lawsuit arrived in a thick manila envelope, delivered with sterile efficiency. The official seal of the courthouse stared back at her, its weight heavier than the paper it was printed on. Josh had gone through with it, filing a legal claim, stating that he was financially dependent on their parents and had been unfairly excluded from their grandfather's inheritance. The argument was absurd, but it was enough to drag her into another exhausting battle. What made it worse was that their parents had sided with him. They weren't just supporting his claim, they were demanding compensation for all the years they helped her. It was laughable. They had never helped her. They had never paid for her education, never assisted with her expenses, never once offered her the kind of unconditional support they had showered on Josh. And yet, here they were, rewriting history to suit themselves. Jules sat in the cabin's small office, surrounded by paperwork. Her lawyer had been blunt. Josh's claim was flimsy, but if left unchallenged, it could drag on for months. The legal system didn't favor emotions, it favored proof, and that was exactly what she needed to focus on. She wasn't just going to win. She was going to ensure that no one, Josh, her parents, or anyone else, could ever challenge her right to this place again. She went to work. Her first step was gathering evidence. She spent days combing through financial records, pulling every document that proved she had never received a dime from their parents, every tuition payment, every rent check, every expense she had covered alone. She wanted to leave no room for doubt. The next step was dismantling Josh's claim. A forensic analyst was brought in to examine the letter he had presented at the housewarming party. The results were exactly as she expected, clear evidence of forgery. The handwriting wasn't their grandfather's. The strokes were too smooth, too precise. The ink analysis showed it had been written months after their grandfather had already transferred the cabin to her. Josh had committed fraud. Her cousin, Sophia, was the only family member who stood by her side. Unlike their parents, she had seen through the lies from the beginning. The night of the party had changed everything for her, too. She had grown tired of the manipulation, of the way their parents twisted reality to fit their version of events. She cut them off, choosing truth over blind loyalty. Jules appreciated her support, but she knew this battle was hers alone to fight. The day of the trial arrived sooner than she expected. She walked into the courthouse, her head held high, the notarized deed to the cabin secured in her lawyer's briefcase. Josh was already seated across the room, his confidence forced, his eyes darting nervously around. Their parents sat beside him, their expressions unreadable. The proceedings began. Josh's lawyer spoke first, painting him as a struggling son who had been left out of his grandfather's final wishes due to an unfair technicality. He claimed that Josh had relied on the expectation of inheriting the cabin and had made financial decisions under that belief. It was a weak argument, but Jules remained silent, letting them dig themselves deeper. Then it was her turn. Her lawyer methodically dismantled every point Josh had made. First, the forensic analyst took the stand, explaining the clear discrepancies in Josh's forged letter, the differences in the ink, the unnatural steadiness of the handwriting, the digital manipulation of the scanned signature. Every detail was laid bare. Then came the financial records. One by one they were presented, statements showing that Jules had supported herself entirely, that their parents had never given her a cent, that Josh had always been the one who was financially dependent. The judge listened, unimpressed by Josh's attempts to interrupt. Then the final blow was delivered. The original notarized deed transferring the cabin to Jules was presented. There was no contesting it, no loophole, no claim. Their grandfather's decision had been final. The judge didn't deliberate for long. The ruling was swift. Josh's lawsuit was dismissed, and his attempt to claim the cabin was declared fraudulent. And just like that, the last of their control slipped away. As the verdict was read, Jules didn't look at them. She didn't need to. She felt the shift, the unspoken acknowledgement that this was the end, that they no longer had power over her. Josh stormed out first, his desperation now laid bare for all to see. His reputation, already fragile, had been shattered. Their parents hesitated, looking at her as if expecting her to feel regret, to show some kind of weakness. But she didn't. She stood tall, her expression unreadable. For the first time in her life, she was truly free. 1 year had passed since Jules had walked out of that courtroom, finally severing the last tether her family had on her. The weight that had once sat heavy on her chest, the expectation, the guilt, the quiet resentment, had disappeared like smoke in the wind. The cabin, once a battleground of betrayal and manipulation, had become her sanctuary. It was hers, not just on paper, but in every sense of the word. She had restored it, maintained it, and most importantly, reclaimed it as a place of peace. The seasons had shifted, carrying her through the long months of reflection and growth. She had spent the summer rebuilding, physically and emotionally, repairing broken floorboards and broken trust in herself. Autumn had been filled with quiet nights on the porch, watching the lake change colors as the leaves fell around her. By winter, she had found her rhythm, working remotely as a consultant for an environmental nonprofit and volunteering with a mentorship program for young women in STEM. Her world had become hers to shape. She had never felt more free. Then the letter arrived. It came in a thick envelope, the handwriting on the front unmistakable. Her parents. She didn't open it immediately. Instead, she placed it on the kitchen counter, staring at it for a long moment before walking away. She already knew what it contained. Apologies wrapped in justifications, regret laced with blame, words that looked like accountability but carried none of its weight. Days passed before she finally unfolded the letter. As expected, the words inside were carefully crafted. Her mother had written most of it, her father adding only a few lines at the end. They spoke of misunderstanding, of family ties that should never have been broken, of wishing they had handled things differently. But the core of it remained the same. There was no true acceptance of fault, no real understanding of what they had done, just an attempt to smooth over the past without acknowledging the damage they had inflicted. Josh's name was barely mentioned, as if his actions had been incidental rather than deliberate. Instead, the focus was on their pain, on the fractures within the family, on their belief that Jules had been too harsh in cutting them off. They had lost everything. Their social standing, the illusion of control, even Sophia, who had seen through them at last. Sophia had left months ago, taking a position with a humanitarian organization abroad. She had spent years chasing the validation of their parents, shaping her life around their expectations, always seeking their approval. But after the lawsuit, after the courtroom, after everything that had been laid bare, she had finally stepped away. She had called Jules before she left, her voice softer, freer than Jules had ever heard it. For the first time, Sophia had chosen herself. They spoke regularly now, exchanging messages and updates on their lives. It wasn't perfect. They were still unlearning years of silent competition, of comparison, of a dynamic neither of them had created, but had always existed between them. But they were trying, and that was enough. Jules placed the letter back into the envelope, her decision made before she even realized it. She wouldn't respond. She didn't need to. There was nothing left to say to them. Instead, she turned her attention to what truly mattered. Her work had become a source of fulfillment, a way to channel her past struggles into something meaningful. She had started mentoring young women, guiding them through the same obstacles she had once faced: self-doubt, external expectations, the quiet pressure to shrink themselves to fit the roles others had written for them. She had become the person she had needed when she was younger. It wasn't just about success anymore. It wasn't about proving anything, not to her family, not to Josh, not even to herself. It was about living on her own terms, about standing firmly in her worth, without needing outside validation. She thought back to the cabin, how it had once been the center of the battle over her grandfather's legacy. Now it was simply a home, a place where she could breathe, create, and dream. It had become a space where she hosted small gatherings with friends, where she could sit in solitude and watch the lake shift with the seasons. It had become a place of healing, and most importantly, it had become hers. She stepped onto the porch that evening, watching the last remnants of the sunset fade over the water, The sky was painted in soft shades of pink and gold, reflecting off the rippling surface. It was quiet, peaceful, the kind of peace she had been searching for all her life. Her phone buzzed with a message from Sophia. "Thinking of you. Let's talk soon." Jules smiled, typing back a simple response, always. She took a deep breath, the cool night air filling her lungs. For years, she had fought for a place to belong, for recognition, for fairness. But standing there, looking at the life she had built for herself, she realized something profound. She had already won, not through revenge, not through proving herself to people who would never truly see her, but by choosing herself. And for the first time, that was enough. The crisp mountain air filled Jules' lungs as she stood at the entrance of her retreat center, the Julia Carter Foundation. The moment felt surreal. 5 years of struggle, growth, and self-discovery had led her here. She had built something meaningful, something that stood as a testament to her resilience. The center was a sanctuary for those seeking healing, a place for people who had spent too long fighting to be seen. It wasn't just a physical space, it was an idea, a purpose, a promise to those who had once felt alone. She had created what she wished had existed for her younger self as she took in the sight before her, the carefully designed gardens, the peaceful cabins overlooking the lake, the small group of attendees gathering for the opening. Her phone vibrated in her pocket. A new email. The sender's name made her pause. Her parents. For a moment, she simply stared at it, the weight of everything they had put her through pressing against her chest. She knew exactly what the email would say: regret, justification, a carefully worded attempt at reconciliation without true accountability. 5 years ago, she might have opened it. She might have let the words sink into her skin, reawakening old wounds. She might have questioned herself, wondered if she had been too harsh, too unforgiving, but not today. Without hesitation, she swiped left and deleted it. She didn't need to read it. She already knew who they were. And more importantly, she knew who she was, someone who had stopped waiting for their approval long ago. Jules lifted her gaze to the retreat center's sign. The bold letters stood strong against the wooden frame. The Julia Carter Foundation, a place for healing and truth. The truth had been the hardest lesson of all. The truth that love should never come with conditions. That validation from others would never outweigh the certainty she carried within herself. That family was not defined by blood, but by the people who chose to stand by you. A soft breeze rustled through the trees as the first guests arrived. Women seeking refuge, mentorship, or simply a quiet place to rebuild. They came from all walks of life, carrying burdens of their own, looking for the same peace she had once fought to find. She turned to greet them, warmth filling her chest. This was what mattered. Not the people who had refused to love her fully, but the ones who still had a chance to love themselves. Jules took one final glance at her phone screen. Blank now. The message erased like the last remnants of their control over her. Then, with a steady breath, she stepped forward. She had already won, not by fighting them, but by choosing herself. As the sun set over the retreat center, the camera lingered on the sign before fading to black. The story of Jules and Josh is a powerful reminder that truth, preparation, and self-worth are key in navigating life's challenges. In today's world, family favoritism, entitlement, and deception are more common than we'd like to admit. Many people face situations where they are overlooked, taken advantage of, or pressured into giving up what is rightfully theirs, all for the sake of maintaining peace. One major lesson here is the importance of documentation and preparation. Jules' grandfather ensured that everything was legally secured, protecting her from Josh's lies. In real life, whether it's finances, property, or career advancements, having clear records and legal safeguards can prevent manipulation and betrayal. Another takeaway is trusting your instincts. When something feels wrong, investigate. Don't accept things at face value just because they come from someone close to you. Blind trust can lead to exploitation, especially when jealousy and entitlement come into play. Most importantly, setting boundaries and choosing self-respect over guilt is crucial. Jules could have given in to family pressure, but she stood firm. In life, it's okay to walk away from toxic relationships. You don't need anyone's approval to claim what is rightfully yours. If this story resonated with you, remember, your worth isn't defined by anyone else's approval. Strength comes from standing firm, knowing your value, and refusing to let others rewrite your story. If you love stories of resilience, justice, and empowerment, subscribe now and join our amazing community of strong, independent women. Let's embrace our journeys, because the best revenge is living well. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss what's coming next.